back and forth a lot with the film that you would choose for this program, because there's a lot a lot to work with, and you're a sort of I consider it's a privilege to have you be part of the UAE film community, and to have you among us. And I know you're still here in Abu Dhabi, and leading the discussion from there. So I'm very happy that we landed on a film that perhaps can only be done justice in a format like this, that is conversational, that is a discussion kind of driven film. I think we also discussed a lot of in the past few weeks how to we reopened the cinema with Raoul Peck's "I Am Not Your Negro" at the start of the after the murder of George Floyd, and it was the reopening of the cinema as a way of beginning to start a conversation, an honest conversation here in the UAE, and the communities that we're engaged with around racial injustice and prejudice, and this is exactly the kind of film that touches upon the issue closer to home and close to home, and something that we live with here in the Gulf, and vis-a-vis the relationship to South Asia and to India specifically. So it's very close to home, and I always say that Dubai is very much as much as it's part of the United Arab Emirates and is an Arab city, it is very much an Indian city and a South Asian city for all intents and purposes, and engaged with all the complexities of the conversations around specifically the caste system that we're going to discuss today. Without further ado, I would just say a few words that again don't do Surabhi's work justice. She has been an independent filmmaker, making feature-length documentaries and short films since 2000. Her documentaries, fiction, and video installations engage with cities in transition, using the lens of labor, music, migration. Her films have been screened and awarded at international film festivals, and her works have been screened at international festivals like the Dubai International Film Festival, the Yamagata International Documentary Festival, the Mami or Mumbai Film Festival, among others. Her video installations have been exhibited at the NGBK Berlin, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Bi-City Biennial of Urbanism and Architecture, and the 11th Shanghai Biennial 2016. Her films have also been recognized and awarded at the 8th Asia Pacific Screen Awards, Brisbane 2016, Eco Cinema, Greece 2003, Film South Asia, Kathmandu 2001, Karachi Film Festival 2002, and the Festival of Three Continents, Buenos Aires 2002. She is currently teaching in the Film and New Media program at the New York University, Abu Dhabi. So without further ado, I hand over the baton to you, Surabhi, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I just want to sort of begin by talking about how we chose this film. So actually on a Facebook group, we were exchanging and discussing lists of films that we need to watch in the context of the Black Lives Movement that is taking place in the US, and it's new with the newest provocation, and in Europe. And in that context, actually, I started feeling that it's really important, of course, to discuss the way the Black Lives Movement is unfolding currently in the US and Europe, but to also look at each of our locations and see, one, how racism plays out in whichever location we are in, and recognize that the way racism plays out, is seen, is recognized, is different in all our locations. And so when I look at India, which is a country I come from, a very close parallel to racism is casteism in India. In India, we have racism as well. We have colorism that sort of overlaps and folds into racism, but we have something called the caste system and casteism that is very close to the way we understand racism in the US. But there are also differences. But in terms of what are the similarities, these are both forms of segregation, of injustice, of violence that have played out in racism. There is the shadow of slavery, of the history of slavery that continues to unfold in different ways. In India, we have the social, cultural, religious sanction of caste that has played out over centuries and has a very, very, very sophisticated set of codes that inherently are violent, are unjust, and are deeply discriminatory. In modern America, in the current America, we have affirmative action, where legally there has been an attempt to, in a sense, right this wrong. And in India, ever since we got independence, we have what is called reservation in both education and in the job market to right this wrong of the kind of centuries of discrimination that lower castes have gone through. We know very well how both affirmative action and reservation has been subverted time and time again because of deep racism and casteism in institutions, in the way our modern societies have panned out. In that context, I thought it was very important to look at caste in India, in the subcontinent, but also see how caste migrates to, let's say, a region like the UAE or the Gulf, or America for that matter. And what are the different ways in which casteism sort of folds into racism? What are the different ways in which caste becomes invisibilized? Because outside of India, we don't recognize caste as a form of injustice, the way it is recognized legally in India, right? But so how can we open up this film? How can we unpack this film to broach on all these topics? But now I'll actually very briefly try and give you a context of the film per se. And the film that I've chosen is, there are 2-3 things I want to flag. One is that this is a documentary film. It is not a commercial feature film from the Hindi industry or the Tamil industry or the Malayalam industry. So there's a particular syntax and film language of the documentary that is very different from the commercial fiction cinema that we have in India. So for me, this film speaks far more eloquently to the issues at stake. And that is why, and of course, being a documentary filmmaker, I almost always veer towards the documentary film, especially from my country, to really talk about both film movement and the issues at stake. Now, this particular film is made in the context of Kerala. Caste, the way it plays out in India, is different from region to region. I could almost say it's unrecognizable. So I am not from Kerala, I'm from the north, I'm from Punjab. I need to educate myself to even understand what caste in Kerala means, because the historical context is very different from the rest of the country. And I'm going to flag some of those issues for you to be able to understand how one can view caste within Kerala. So one is that this is a documentary film from Kerala, which is a very different context from the rest of the country. But I also chose this film because this is a film about a music band that is reclaiming their sense of history and identity through their music and putting it out there and changing the cultural landscape. I thought this, again, very importantly and interestingly connects to the Black Power movement since the 50s, 60s in America, and how music plays a part in that movement, but equally how music is consumed while racism is not erased, right? So there's a strange relationship we have with the production of music and the music industry. And I think there's some very interesting things happening with this band and this particular form of music in Kerala that I would want to talk about. Now, very, very briefly, Kerala, as many of you over here might know, has had a very strong communist movement, a left movement, since soon after the independence. And that has changed the cultural social landscape differently from the rest of the country. So the kind of caste violence and the in-the-face casteism that you see in the rest of the country, you don't see it that obviously in Kerala. And there is almost now, in so many years of the Communist Party coming to power every 5 years or 4 years in Kerala, there's almost a sense that caste doesn't exist in Kerala anymore. We have erased, there is no caste violence, there is no caste discrimination. And this film stands testimony and is witness to the fact that that is not the case. Now, in Kerala, one was the communist movement. There was also a rationalist movement that initially began with there is one caste and one God, and eventually by the 50s, 60s actually said there is no caste, right? So there's a lot of complicated ways in which caste gets completely hidden and not recognized in Kerala, which is not the case in other states. Now, this becomes, again, I thought, an important way to think about race and caste in the UAE. And of course, also, how can we make meaning of both sets of injustices and movements by sort of, bouncing off each other? Like, what do we understand of the Black Lives Movement in the US that can make us and help us understand this film? How can the specifics of the film and the Dalit movement, I'm going to start using the word Dalit as the word that is used for the oppressed castes. It's a political term that they use for themselves to self-identify. And it's a very political term. So I'm going to be using the word, I will not use the word lower caste, I will use the word Dalit. So the Dalit movement in India, again, in different parts of the country have very different histories, but there is a very strong political movement that exists. Now, how does this film and how does the story of this band and these musicians connect with all these different things that I have mapped out? And I'm hoping that the discussion will sort of open that out. But now I'll sort of speak a little to the film itself, the film as the text. The film, I had a very, so this is a filmmaker I know, and he is, in fact, the filmmaker and many members of the band are watching this discussion on YouTube. They did not want to join the discussion, but they're all there. So a big hello to all of them from all of us. But the filmmaker Ranjit is somebody I know because the documentary community is large, but it's not that large. So we all pretty much know each other. We more or less have come from the same film schools. So I've known Ranjit for a while, and I sort of know of this film ever since he made it. But for this discussion, I had a long chat with him, which was very important and very interesting for me to re-understand the film. So one of the things that I want to put out there about the film is that Ranjit, the filmmaker, is not of the same caste as the cast, the band members, but he has known this group, and the group members have been his friends since he was a school-going kid, actually. Because again, in Kerala, there was this very strong literacy mission in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was part of, if you've seen the film, there is one of the band members says, as part of this literacy mission, he started collecting songs, going to different Dalit groups and tribal groups and collecting songs. And that is how the genesis of the band came about. Ranjit, the filmmaker, was part of this national literacy mission. Kerala, again, you might know, has claims and proudly claims 100% literacy, unlike the rest of the country. But this Ranjit was part of this campaign. And it is through that he became very close associate of this band. So this filmmaker knows the story of this band very closely. And there's something very important that I think we can talk about and discuss that the band actually gained a lot of popularity as a folk band, as folk music, not as an assertion of Dalit identity. So yes, they were singing songs about their grandparents and forefathers being oppressed and injustice done to them, but their popularity grew as folk musicians who used folk instruments. So there's a particular sound of the music that was embraced by all, not necessarily the politics. In fact, the politics was hidden. It's the filmmaker who, when he began, so he's been filming the band and their performances for years. But when he decided to make the film, it is he who initiated this conversation. And it was a conversation that none of the band members were having with each other about their experiences of both discrimination and their memories of oppression of their parents and grandparents and the stories that are in their families. So it was the film actually that foregrounded a certain politics of the music rather than the band themselves. So the film actually plays a very interesting role in making that their band the vehicle to bring about another conversation. And as Ranjit himself told me, that when he was working on his rough cut, he was a little anxious because he wasn't quite sure that the band members would be comfortable in him foregrounding the caste and the Dalit oppression issue so much and making it less about the music. And of course, he said that once he showed them the rough cut, because he wasn't going to make the film without their consent, it was extremely emotional, not meeting, but a couple of days, where suddenly they were all aware of the fact that they had not spoken even to each other, even in the intimacy of their own band, about their own experiences of caste oppression. Another very important thing, so this film is already now, I think, I'm forgetting when it was made, but I think 7-8 years old already. It seems in the past 5 years, there have been a lot of music bands of Dalit youth, men and women, young men and young women, who have actually gone a step ahead and made caste the foregrounding issue of their music. So it's now become political music and not folk music or people's music as a communist Kerala would like to sort of embrace, where you erase caste and make it about people's music, right? So there is this attempt at bringing another conversation in, which I think is extremely marvelous. Within the film itself, there might be many of you who have missed a lot of details about signifiers of caste and how to understand oppression. Again, very briefly, I'll just give you a certain context. So the house that the main band member lives in, which is demolished by the end of the film, and it's a very, very, very poignant, in a sense, and very complicated metaphor that sort of develops through the film. But that particular house is a house built by his parents, as you know through the film, but it's built on the common land of the village, the local government land that allowed Dalit families who worked the fields of the upper castes to set up home over there. So the land is not owned by the people who have built the houses. So they are, in a sense, not the rightful owners. Until the magnanimity of the village exists, they have their house. This particular, the main band member actually bought land to build his own house so that he could be the owner. There's this idea of being an owner. And that is when they started building that house and moving. Sorry, what was that? Okay. The upper caste temple, the family that owns the main temple, they promptly, without notice, began demolition of the house because they wanted to widen the road leading to the temple. And the family that moved to the new house, as you might have again realized, the house is, of course, much better looking. It's a concrete house. They have the wiring in place, but they don't have the money for a switchboard. So even today, in a modern place like Kerala, where you don't see the kind of poverty you see in the rest of the country, you have homes that just don't have the means to have electricity. And so it's a particular way in which the story unfolds, where everything that gives you a sense of mobility to social and economic betterment slips you back 2 steps. And it's a really important parallel in which to understand the kind of issues being raised in the US just now, as well. So it's in materially, you think you are always getting slightly better, but there are ways in which almost institutionally and socially you're always on the back foot again. And I thought that Ranjit, the filmmaker, in a very, very nuanced, very delicate, very complicated way, brought these issues out, where it's not as if that now that they've formed the band, they have become the rock stars in Kerala. They're very popular, but that doesn't mean too much. The fact that his parents slaved as farm hands to educate him, that education, that master's degree, has not led to him becoming, for example, a college professor. Having access to subsidized land so that you're the owner of the land, not just of your labor, which is the lives his parents led, does not mean that you're materially going to be any more comfortable, right? So it's a really, I feel that the film, in a sense, puts forward a whole bunch of very, very interesting ideas, very important ideas, politically extremely important ideas, especially at this point in time in India, where actually in the rest of the country we are seeing onslaught of caste violence, of lynching of people from the lower caste, being played out in this very theatrical way, recorded by the ones who are lynching, are recording that video and playing it out with absolutely no fear of either law or reprisal. In fact, there seems to be a way in which they are being congratulated, right? So at this current time, whether it is in India or in the US, it's an urgent necessity to really talk about these issues. But I feel that the filmmaker manages to speak about these very complicated issues without only talking about creating a language of victimhood. There is of course the victimhood, but there is a way in which Dalit groups in India, or particularly this group and others like them, are trying to own their own narrative, which again I think you have a very, very important and very relevant and very timely kind of narrative playing out in the US just now. It has been playing out since the 50s, 60s, but I think the current way in which it's unfolding has a lot of things to tell us. At this point, I would actually really like to open it out to the others, because I think it would be very interesting to see how many of you have viewed the film, and how perhaps we could sort of dig into the film to open up this bundle of issues. I'm very happy to speak on any of the points that I've raised just now, but I would still rather that we make it a conversation where we can open up the ideas, because again, I would be happy to, there are many things that might not be very clear in the film itself to somebody outside of that context. Again, Deepak, my colleague, is here. I had a very long chat with him to prepare for this conversation, because the way caste plays out in the region here and how it's invisibilized, I'm too new in the region to feel confident to speak about that. Similarly, because it's Kerala and I'm a North Indian, I really did do a lot of, research before I was ready to take on this discussion, because it's almost like it's another country. And plus, again, an Indian will be able to recognize my name already speaks of the caste I am from, and I come from the upper caste, a very privileged upper caste. So one also needs to really step outside one's privilege and not assume that I have understood the story. So at least I've sort of begun that conversation. So I'm happy to open up all those layers and complexities depending on where you would like to take the discussion.
Since we're a small group, I will suggest that you can just unmute yourself and join the conversation. So Nizam started.
Hi, Surabhi. First of all, I would like to say this thing, that it's uncomfortable that we're having this discussion about Dalit calls without having a member from subaltern community. That's where we are. There is no one to talk about their cause when we are having such a discussion. When it comes to the movie, I've been part of, I have attended their concerts, Karindar Lakutam's concerts before, maybe a couple of years ago, 3-4 years ago. And there are lots of bands. So when it comes to the folklore music, the issue in Kerala, the folklore music is not not considered as music. They have separated as folklore. So for them, the music is Carnatic, classical, or whatsoever. So they are facing this issue and they are addressing this issue in different. So there is a book called Unheard Voices by a Dalit songwriter called A.S. Ajit Kumar. He addresses this issue, the unheard voices, caste, body, and songs. So that's the name of the book. It's not yet translated to English. It's still in the original language. When you are talking about the communist government and the caste issues in Kerala, which is comparatively very less compared to other Indian states, the problem is that we always, the Keralites, we always compare with others. Actually, we should not do that. There are lots of issues in the wasteland where the owner is telling that they don't have his parents are that they don't have title deeds for their house, which is caused by the very first communist government when they had given lands to these people only 3 cents. 3 cents is not even enough to build a home. So these things, when it comes to the land, when it comes to the power, even the so-called caught progressive and caught communist government or the communist party in India, if you look into their representation, their Politburo members in India, the representation from the subaltern community, there isn't even a single Politburo member from the community. So the oppression from so-called progressive movements are there, or so-called progressive governments are there, and on the other side there is right-wing people who is ruling the central, the Indian government, that also there. So basically, the power in India or in Kerala, the power is, considered when they have land and when they have shelter and when they have representation in government. So none of these issues are not covered. So also another thing with music, if you know the bands from South India like Tirukural, Tamil Nadu, this and the other bands, they have a connection with Western hip hops. The black music connection. So especially when it comes to Tirukural, the music they have produced recently, it has lots of similarities when we are talking about the music of hip hop, rap music from US or which are done by the black community. So it's not only about the folklore music, I don't know how to say that. So there's a assertion of identity. They're coming out of themselves by hiding their community. I mean, they have used to do that. In Kerala, one of the prominent singer is Yeshadas, if you know him. So he is from subaltern Christian community. So he always used to hide his identity by embracing Hindu community, and he always wanted to visit. I mean, he always wanted to be known as a caste Hindu idol. I mean, he is from a subaltern Christian community, but yeah, he's trying to be a part of upper caste Hindu community. But nowadays, I mean, not nowadays. It's been a long history. I mean, when you take it started from Ambedkar and then came to Ayyankali or Srinarayana Guru or Paikal of the Chan. So there is long history of identity assertion happening in Kerala. So just want to say this.
Thanks so much, Nizam, for that. Yeah, these are all really important points. And of course, it's not to say that the communist movement in Kerala has meant that the Dalit community has not been discriminated. In fact, what I was trying to say is that it just gets hidden. And there is a sense that there is no caste anymore in Kerala, which is totally not, and the film is testimony to that. One of the things, and yes, Nizam, it's very clear and something that needs to be announced every time, that here again all of us from India who are there are my name, as I said, says out loud what my caste is, and what so there, yes, the subaltern voice is absent from these discussions even today. But I thought that Ranjit in his film was really able to in a sense bridge that conversation. So yes, it is his film, but I could see very clearly that this was a film made with the group, and even though he was the one forcing certain issues in, I thought there was a way in which the film allowed the space for the group members to sort of self-represent. And I think, again, I want to flag something over here. A very important thing that happens in the film for me as a viewer is there is the idea of food that is there in the song. Food really represents generations of being marginalized, of the food you don't have access, you just don't eat, right? Because you don't have it. And then there were all these sequences where when the band members are together, they're either cooking or they're eating together. And there's this absolutely beautiful way in which that thread, I thought, developed about, looking at food cultures, and within food cultures, how do you read through these histories of marginalization, of injustice, of community, of togetherness, of building a certain narrative. So just wanted to also again flag the kind of ideas that I think the filmmaker was able to pull out, and which is why I say the film isn't just a film that is sort of representing a victim story. I think that there's many ways in which, again, I would like to open it out here to others who might have things they might want to say about the film or about things within the film that they didn't quite get. And then Nizam is there, Deepak is there, I'm there to sort of give you the context. Any more observations about?
I guess I'm a bit curious about what the conversation was between you and Deepak in preparation for this discussion, and maybe just reflecting on my kind of curiosity on your observations as a filmmaker and as a scholar of film, operating in the Gulf and kind of seeing how perhaps the caste system and the biases that that migrate to some degree play out here, if at all. And yeah, just kind of curious how you were reflecting on watching this film in this context.
Deepak, would you like to begin? Or?
Surabhi, why don't you start? And then
Okay. So I think, I'll be quoting you, Deepak. So I think a very important point that Deepak makes, and in the last 2 days after my conversation with Deepak, there's something that has happened in the US that I'm going to bring into the conversation. So what, I think an important thing that Deepak said is the way caste migrates to a region like the Gulf, where there's a large Indian population, is it in a sense gets invisibilized, because you're not the Indian community can see caste, but the others in the UAE cannot see caste. But what you can see is occupation, and occupation is very caste based. So there is a certain, which is why I am a NYU AD professor. There's a certain professional class that comes from a particular caste. There is going to be another caste that comes, when migrant workers move over here. There is not just the issue of caste. There is also the issue of religion. Which community and which caste from within that community is moving under what occupation, and that is the way to recognize caste in the region. So over here, the UAE government or the US government does not recognize caste. So in that sense, we can say that they are not practicing any caste discrimination. But there is a way in which you are able to recognize occupation. There are ways in which people from different occupations are given residences in certain areas. So willy-nilly, there is a sense of segregation. There is a sense, while yes, you are able to move from India to the UAE and maybe earn better money, but your mobility within that context doesn't change. If I've come here as a construction worker, I cannot leave from here as a shopkeeper or someone who has an office job, right? So there's a way in which caste gets reproduced, and you stay in your. And in fact, there is a way in which there's further segregation over here than even back home. Back home, you have to live amongst the same neighborhoods. Here, there is a way in which it gets separated completely. The incident that I want to talk about that happened in the last 2 days, and there's some fantastic writing, I'll give links to that at the end of this discussion, is that in California, in Silicon Valley, a big software company called Cisco, there is a person who has filed a case against Cisco and his bosses for caste-based discrimination against him. The US law does not recognize caste. It's not the first time. It does not recognize caste, but this case has gone in because he's able, this software engineer, from a very prestigious institute in India, IIT, the Indian Institute of Technology, which is like the creme de la creme of the engineers. He goes to Cisco, to California, and finds somebody from his cohort in IIT who remembers that he came as a reservation student. That is on the basis of affirmative action. And he then plays out his caste biases and actually stops his work and his promotions. So this man has filed a case and said that every move to discriminate against me was based on caste. You have to take this into account. Caste discrimination has to be taken into account in American law. So it's open, and because of the context of the Black Lives Movement, it's opened a really important and very interesting discussion. Now, within the expat community in the UAE, within the professional class, this story has not come out. This story comes out in the US now, and it's not a new story. It's not the first incident of this kind, right? So I think these are some of the ideas that we really need to think about. And it's not just the Indian expat community expressing casteism. how does the rest of the region start looking at different occupations and creating silos in which people are put aside? And in that sense, can we see that as an extension of casteism? Can we see that as an extension of racism? And how do the two overlap? And what does that mean in this context? I think it's a very difficult and very uncomfortable question that we all need to ask ourselves. Deepak, if you could sort of chime in.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. So first, I didn't know I was going to be a participant. I thought I was really going to be listening. And then when I got the email, I thought of writing back and saying maybe I'd prefer to listen rather than talk, but I didn't know what position that left me in. There's one thing I'd like to begin with, and Nizam sort of stated it. I don't represent the community. So it doesn't necessarily put me in an awkward position, but what it does do is it tells me that I cannot speak on behalf of the community. However, I can speak from certain vantage points. For those who know very little about me, my parents are Malayali, and they belong to the Nair community, the upper caste, right below Brahmins, I think. I forget the order. But in the film, there's a scene where gentlemen are discussing who treats the Dalit community better. And there's a sort of riff about, well, Brahmins are better than Nayars because Nayars really, they're the elites. And they're right. They're absolutely right. Because when I was growing up, and I went to an Indian community school here, so this is piggybacking on some questions that were asked earlier. In my school, we did not have a frank and comprehensive discussion about caste. We were told who the personalities were. Dr. Ambedkar was mentioned and others were mentioned, but we never sat down and we were never given text to sort of pour through or pour over and reflect on what happened to marginalized communities in the homeland. However, when you were little, at least when I was little, I can't speak on behalf of the entire Malayali community and the Gulf, certainly not in Abu Dhabi, I would hear throwaway comments from relatives or extended family members about the fact that, such and such person is of this caste, and they'd just stop talking, which I found quite interesting because they would stop talking because it was sort of understood that labels represented many things and it was understood what they represented. Bill in the chat box has sort of mentioned the scene where the band members of Karindalakotama in, I think it was Malaysia, and they're being sort of instructed by the gentleman who's curating the show, who's invited them to be there. You can tell from the way he behaves with them that you know who is in charge. Because for me, as a little boy, it was really clear that casteism was also about what you were allowed or permitted to do, how you moved, how you walked, who you ate with, who you couldn't eat with. Every now and again when we would go to Kerala, and like I said, my family members belong to the Nair community, and we had individuals who I suppose in English parlance would be called the help, and I'm being, I suppose, politically correct there. The word that's really bandied about is servants or maids. And these were throwaway labels. And you would have individuals who would refuse to eat in the household simply because they felt they couldn't do it or they weren't permitted to do it. And this is something that we normalized. When I say we, I'm talking about members of my community. So the supposition or the assumption that when you're in the Gulf, none of these things exist is, if I may be frank, ridiculous. And it's ridiculous simply because the assumption is when we come here to the Gulf, Indians are Indians and certain things are sort of kept aside. I don't think so. It's fascinating, Surabhi, that you mentioned the conversation that Ranjit, the director, asked him to sort of partake in, and the realization that they didn't converse at all because they weren't sure how to. And I'm speaking on behalf of them, so forgive me because I know they're watching. That resonated deeply with me as an individual who grew up in the Gulf, because I grew up with individuals who didn't know what to talk about or how to talk about, say, hashtag belonging, or say hashtag transience, or just what it means to sort of be of a place but not of a place, because we didn't have the vocabulary. So you had individuals, and it's ironic, I work for an American institution, academics and scholars writing on behalf of you, even though they weren't part of your community. So I can't even imagine what it's like to feel written about when you aren't necessarily the one doing the writing. Nizam mentioned earlier texts in Malayalam. He referenced one which hasn't been translated into English. I know in India there's now a little bit of a movement to get things translated from regional languages and dialects into English, which is the language of power at the end of the day. But we need more of that. And let me end with this, because as I was watching the film, I couldn't help but think about the Roma or the Romani. There's a documentary called Lachodrome, which I watched when I was very young, directed by Tony Gatliff. And it's basically about the Romani and how they moved from what is present-day India to places all around the world, whether it's the Arab world, Africa, or even in Europe. And all they do, I say all they do, and you have to hyphenate that, is they sing and they make music. And what is interesting to me about that is every time I've watched a Romani performer, they're applauded for their music, and then there's very little traction about their livelihood, about what they return to, because they're one of the most marginalized communities on earth, very similar to the Dalit situation, but it's also about something else. It's about the appropriation of what someone is supposed to be. So when I'm watching Karandalakotam sing about their lives, it is sobering. It is sobering simply because it's frank and honest, and they're talking to their own people, which I think is really, really important, because they're not having anyone else do the talking for them. That's why the scene that Bill mentioned was quite cutting, because you have someone instructing them, basically schooling them and saying, if you do this right, there will be multiple opportunities for you. And coming from an individual who's clearly upper caste, that's quite rich. And like I said, I grew up here, and that is really familiar to me. This idea of respect, that if you're respectful enough, good things will happen to you, but you need to wait, you need to be patient. As someone who belongs to the community, the Nair community, frankly, sometimes it's disgraceful what we have done for generations. And we need to rectify and correct things and start to educate members of our own community by, first of all, talking to children, ensuring that there is transmission and communication between different parties, because I think we owe it to ourselves, and we also owe it to other people. So I'll end there. So to answer Buthena in a long-winded way, when Surabhi asked if we could chat, I wasn't necessarily sure where to begin. Because I'm not a member of the Dalit community. However, things resonated really strongly as I watched the film. And I speak the language, but I don't read it, as in Malayalam. And you wonder how you are complicit. At least I wonder how I am complicit when I return to Kerala, because I am. Whether it's by direct I suppose, what's the word I'm looking for? Contact or indirect contact because of my family members, but I'm complicit in this system. And something needs to be done about that. So if that helps to sort of throw a spanner in the works a little bit.
Thanks so much, Deepak. I'm just going to pick up from what you've said, but also address Bill's question. Before I get to Bill's question, actually, again, I wanted to give you a certain narrative that the filmmaker very, very carefully allows to develop within the film, which is that the main protagonist speaks about the fact that their music was part of temple festivals. So it's not as if their music was separate. They were, even over there, discriminated against. They were invited to perform after 10 p.m. at night, but they were very much part of that fabric. But at some point, as the protagonist mentions, that the upper caste family decided that their performances and their music was a bit too bawdy, and that it was buffoonery, and we don't want it. Again, to go back to Nizam's what the point that he raised, that there was an idea of what is high culture, what is good music, and this was stigmatized. At that point is when all of them started collecting this music and formed their own band and became identified as a folk music group that used original folk instruments, did not mix it up with modern day instruments. Correct, Nizam? Am I correct about that? So that became their USP, and they became very popular in, let me put this word out there, in quote unquote secular spaces. So educational institutions, or all kinds of programs and functions would sort of invite them. So now to come to Bill's question, that when they get invited to a funky music festival in Malaysia, it's great for their popularity. The important thing is, like in Malaysia, people are grooving to the music because the rhythm and the performances are so compelling. In Kerala, in their context, where their language is understood, there is a way in which you are not listening to the language. You are listening to the music. So the music becomes popular. The music is groovy. The rhythm is groovy. And we can pretend that the lyrics are just there. It is now, in these past few years, with many other younger groups, asserting and foregrounding the political aspect of what they're singing that you have. So from being part of the temple but outside, then thrown out of the temple, to becoming great musicians, to now becoming a political, using music as a political stage. I think it's a very important trajectory that the filmmaker teases out of the narrative. It's not just there. It's there but can be forgotten. And I think that's the very interesting and important thing to think about. And yes, thank you, Bill, because I find that that person who organizes the festival and who takes them, he's an Indian. Again, as Indians, from his name, I recognize his upper caste identity. And even the manner in which, I cannot imagine him speaking to any other band from any other part of the country like that. It's because he's Indian and because this is an Indian band, there is, and look at the performers they are like kings on stage. But that particular scene in the room, it hurts. It just hurts. So Bill, I'm glad that you picked that up.
There was a documentary about this thing which you are talking about. The documentary name is "Don't Be Our Fathers." Nice. Okay, this was again made by Rupesh Kumar, a person from the Dalit community. He was addressing these appropriation issues, and there is another book in English, "Hatred in the Delhi." It was written by many Indian scholars, Dalit scholars, Dalit and Adivasi scholars, particularly talking about the appropriation part, which is a very good reference to many of things. Even they were criticizing Arundhati Roy also for writing the doctor and signed introduction for Annihilation of Caste of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's book. Arundhati Roy, in introduction, the doctor and the saint, to the Annihilation of Caste, it was an old book, and the new edition came out as that one with her introduction. So the main focus was moved to Arundhati Roy's introduction rather than the Annihilation of Caste, which I can say Annihilation of Caste is kind of Bible for caste issues in India. That's the main, the one which we can refer for any time, which still has lots, more value in the current situation as well. One more thing I would like to say, Surabhi. So when they perform in the stage, one thing we cannot detach is their body. You see how the body moves. So which is very distinct from the popular in not Indian, Kerala, classical or whatsoever. So we cannot detach their body movements. That's a very distinctive, identity of their way of singing. So which is very important, and we should discuss about that. How these two are connected, the body and the song. It's highly. There has been a debate. Not debate, but people, from the mainstream music community, they don't see it as appropriate one when they use their body moves while they sing.
Yeah. No, absolutely. As I said, that it's the body movement, it's the voice production, it's again the instruments. Again, to give you a slight context, many of the instruments that are used are the sound of those instruments are important for temple festivals, but the instrument and the instrument makers and the instrument players are stigmatized because these are largely percussion instruments where they use cow hide as a base. So there's a whole story around that of how the makers of these percussion instruments and the players of the percussion instruments are impure. Although the sound is absolutely essential, you cannot imagine a temple festival without the most incredible set of percussion instruments, especially in Kerala. It's magnificent. So there is the sound, there's the voice production, which again Nizam brings it out. It's very different from film music in Kerala, and also of course the Carnatic, the classical music. So there is, it's again, it really talks to the kind of music production in the US by Black communities and that sense of sort of reclaiming history, right? There is a certain history of that musicality that is foregrounded, of the way the body moves, that is foregrounded, that has for years been stigmatized, for centuries been stigmatized, which is why an upper caste temple family owner can say, you're too vulgar for our tastes, so stay out. And when that becomes the center of the stage, it's a really important moment. It's a very important moment. But I thought the filmmaker Ranjit put it very, very interestingly. He says, it is still easily packaged in a upper caste audience as something so beautiful and earthy without actually looking into, interrogating yourself and what does that mean? And how is a band like this, even though it's so popular, how is a band like this still such a marginal voice? They're not an obscure group. They're a popular group. But in the pecking order, somehow they disappear. And I really, for me, the film is really quite precious because there are many very, very subtle ways in which a lot of these ideas are put forward. And, really, I feel like I'd like to hear some more about what you thought of the film, Nizar or Kaveh.
First of all, thank you. It was really refreshing. I think I really wanted to echo your point about the structure of the film. It doesn't begin, even though I'd read a little bit about it and the 18 feet or the social distancing of caste and race and gender and sex and all of them. But I really liked that it didn't begin that way. It let the issue of caste subtly grow. And a lot of great choices to actually, there's a lot of great music documentaries all over the world, but this one really held with the music. And I also appreciated that on the director's part.
Batteries.
And I think that one question I had, I guess, or it's a question, is that, you mentioned it. We began by connecting this to Black Lives Matter. We're in a state where we're questioning all these hierarchies that, we are privileged, we speak for the unspoken for as professors and writers and stuff like that sometimes. And is this type of when does it become universal and when is it particular in understanding caste in India? I mean, we know that there is U.S. cultural hegemony when it comes to like the Gay International forcing its agenda on homosexuality in the Arab world, or race in the Arab world is read only through the lens of like a U.S. reading. But in India itself, is the reading of caste like, is it, I think Deepak mentioned like a famous writer, he was Buddha, about the Dalits, Amdibikar, sorry for the pronunciation. But is there some sort of way that this film is absorbed and made universal for all of India that's a problem itself, where this differentiation between the states, whether it's Punjab or, Gujarat and stuff like that, is there a way of negotiating that one has to understand? I hope that made sense, but that was some of the questions I was thinking after you spoke.
Oh, so there's a way in which the film is able to sort of speak where someone from outside the specifics of Kerala is able to recognize and identify and understand. So there is a certain way in which it opens up, which is why me as a North Indian living in Maharashtra, which has its own very, very dense kind of history of caste politics, when I see the film, I'm able to understand. The reason why I thought it was important that and Ranjit and I have actually spoken about the film because I've been a fan of the film ever since I saw it, but it was important for me to try and really get some specific understandings rather than make generalizations. And I think it works that way for someone who's not Indian. So while you might not get the specifics of why is this story different in Kerala and different in Maharashtra, but I think there's a way in which the film allows you to read a history of oppression and a politics of an attempt to self-represent and to claim your own history, and to use the language of oppression as a political tool. I think, like for me, the again, to come back to what Nizam said, the moment the performers walk on stage, there's a different charge that they bring from, let's say, just another very good music performer. There's another kind of charge that, and it's easy to ignore, which is why it can become a really groovy thing in a folk festival in Malaysia, unless the festival was to foreground the narratives that each group brought. And I think there's a way in which it can be done. It's not as if this music should only stay in the context in which it is understood. Again, to come back to Bill's point, there is a way in which that charge translates, where you can connect to it and recognize another story from your context, I think. But again, sorry, Deepak, you want to come in?
No, go ahead, finish, please.
No, but so it is always important to understand the context that is produced this music and this narrative, but equally is there a way? And I think the film is able to open it out. I can say I'm not a Malayali, but I'm married to a Malayali for a long time. So in that sense, I have one foot in Kerala, but I would still not lay claim to fully understanding the story. There's just too much embedded in it, which can be unpacked. And that's the beauty of the film. For somebody from within that context, they're going to be able to see so much. But somebody who has no idea is also able to connect, I think. Sorry, Deepak, you were coming.
No, I interrupted you, Surabhi, forgive me. This is sort of returning to what Nizar was asking about. So if I could go a little bit macro here. The book that really made me reflect and think about things that are important to me was the autobiography of Malcolm X in the States, which is where I did college, simply because there was rage in the work, but it was also how he wrote about rage. And then I started reading more about the Black experience in the United States. It shouldn't have made sense to me. I'm not claiming that I understand it, but there were elements of a bunch of things that I've been sort of processing when I was a little boy that distilled completely when I was in the States, and it made sense. The it I never could identify. It could have been power, it could have been race, it could have been anything at all, or a simple education that I did not have. Because when I left for the States, I had family members basically advising me to be careful of Black people. And that was what you got before you left, because they thought they were being kind and respectful, but they were also being racist, and that wasn't flagged. And then when you got to the States, you had to learn, and you had to decide you needed to learn because you were elsewhere. I started off the conversation by saying that I belong to the Nair community, but I never really got to enjoy the privileges the Nairs enjoyed in Kerala because I grew up in Abu Dhabi. So I got a taste when I returned to Kerala every now and again, when you had a driver pick you up, when you had individuals coming to the house to do work on your behalf, and you could address them by their full name, and they had to call you, I don't know, Master Deepak or Deepagutta or something. I don't know how to translate that into Malayalam. Deepu is what my relatives call me. Or even, and I don't know who's watching from the band, when I say Ramesh Etan, if he's older than me, and if I just say Ramesh, and we're having a conversation in Malayalam, there is a difference there. Ramesh is an exercise of power. Ramesh Etan is basically me speaking to someone as an equal, because that is what he's supposed to be. And here's the irony for me. In my community, when you work here in the Gulf, because professions are stratified, you get not a crash course, you get an education in what it means to sort of be in a place for a long time, especially if you're a blue-collar worker. So in my head, I'm thinking, logically, when you return to your homeland, especially if you are upper class, because you know what it's like to be subjugated, you are sort of educated. But that's not always the case. The irony in Kerala right now is now we have migrant workers coming from India, from other states, working in Kerala, who are not treated really well. And then on the other hand, you have a separate discourse about Malayalis complaining about what life is like in the Gulf. And that's problematic because you're being a hypocrite, and that's a generic you here. And I think at some point, and this is, and I'll end here, when folks ask me, or when they claim that I write about, quote, the voiceless, that is not true at all. I write about my community. I write about my community because for a long time, no one wrote for us. People wrote about us. And now things are changing. But that does not mean that I write about everybody. I can't. I'm not even going to pretend I can. So dipping into fiction is my solution to negotiate and navigate the conundrums I have to sort of deal with as a human being who's marked, whether by race, whether by caste, whether by nationality. That's something else we haven't discussed here. Because in the Gulf, nationality counts too, as a mark of power. It's no accident I speak like this, because we were trained to speak like this when I was in school. Because if you spoke like this, people paid attention to you. People respected you. People looked up towards you. And I said I'd end before, but this is my final sentence, I promise. When Nizam was talking about performers, so, the performative nature of the band itself, and Surabhi touched on this as well, she used a word, vulgarity. When I was in school, vulgar was thrown around or bandied about a lot. And I'll give you a very specific example. We had, in Indian schools, we have something called an elocution competition. You basically, it's like you're running for parliament and you have to give a 5 or 10 minute speech. And you will have instructions in there, specific instructions, where you will be told in writing that it should be a speech and not something vulgar or performative. So you should know the difference between speaking and just shouting. And what is insinuated there is you cannot use your body, you cannot be expressive, you cannot modulate, you have to stand like someone from the British Parliament in front of all your peers, and that is how you must speak. And this is not accidental at all. And then when you return to Kerala, I have had members of my own family look at performers, musicians who can kick ass anywhere in the globe, looking at them and just sort of rolling their eyes because they knew how to use their body. And that's just, yeah, and you don't know what to do with that information when you're a kid because you just assume the right way is to be stoic and you have the stiff upper lip. Malayalis don't talk about this as much. Indians love statistics, by the way, especially Kerala. 100% literacy, even with COVID, the state that's really reining it in, it's a numbers game. But when you ask individuals, especially policymakers, what do you do in the classroom? Do you have a comprehensive conversation about things like this? How do you manage it? Because this takes time. Even in the US, and I consider myself as American as, I suppose, Wonder Bread, this is important to me, everything that's happening in the US. But we all need time to process what's going on. And time means you read, you ask, and occasionally you make mistakes, and hopefully you get corrected by someone who will sit you down and say, this is what you need to know. We have not had this conversation, in my opinion, in the Malayali community in the Gulf. I can't speak about Kerala because I'm not Indian. I didn't grow up in India. I grew up here. We're not having that discussion here in Abu Dhabi. I can tell you that. And I'm complicit. So I have to figure out a way in the classroom to talk about these things with my students and at the same time recognize that I have biases I haven't identified yet. Because I discover a new one every other day. And I have to stop blaming my parents at some point. Indians love to blame their parents because, they're responsible for everything. But at some point, I have to say, this is my responsibility now because I'm almost, 40 years old. And I have to take ownership of the rot that's in place.
Just going to address Bill's comment about the gentrification of areas and how that's a parallel to the American context as well. Here again, I just want to flag something that, the house that is demolished in the film, as I had already mentioned before, is a house located in the common land of the village that was given. But the history to a lot of the Dalit families is that they were able to build land on the lands owned by the feudal lords. So they never owned their own house. They were, in a sense, building their houses because they were allowed to. The only thing that they owned really is their labor. And within that labor were these songs, both songs of work and songs that were sung to sort of tell their story. Now, when this house is demolished and they move to another house where they've bought the land and built their own house by subsidized rates given by the government, these are all segregated colonies. These are, and this phenomenon of Dalit colonies all over Kerala is very, very strong. So you have, and again, it's a universal story. It's happening over here. It's happening in the US. And there's a way in which you have entire pockets that you want to keep away from your eye. So, we all will want to live in our bubbles and keep groups away from us. So this story is again something that we need to recognize in all our own contexts. How is this happening? I am from a city called Bombay, which there is the luxury of segregation in that sense is not there. But even within that, we manage it so successfully. We've all created our little bubbles of gated communities, even if my window overlooks a large slum area. But it's, I think, important reminder that we just need to look into our own context constantly and make connections. I think that's the only way we can, whether we are people of privilege and especially if we are people of privilege and not from the subaltern, I think it's important to recognize all these connections and understand that.
Surabhi, if you will allow me, I'll just throw to our resident producer that has been having this extended discussion or recurring discussion about about budget and low budget filmmaking, and and how to tackle that when thinking about specifically documentary filmmaking. And a film it's like this is a good example of a film that attempts to capture a particular experience, and perhaps is not aimed at the festival circuit or the commercial distribution circuit. So I wanted to hear from you, Kaveh, what your impressions were, and if you had any thoughts to share tonight.
So good that finally when you talk about low budget, you remember me, because I raised my hand for around 45 minutes ago. Good that you're talking low budget. To be honest, anyhow, the discussion went too much far from the film, which I think that it was really useful and it was necessary, because when I'm watching the film, which I should say that I love it a lot, I paused the film too many times and try to reread the titles, because I couldn't, understand the film in the way that I like, and it was obviously clear it's because of a lack of knowledge or misinformation. And thank you so much, Surabhi, Nizam, that I think that this discussion really gave me these things that I missed during the film. In general, I can say it was a very good film. Okay. But and the director was very successful. He gets very close to the protagonist, not that much close to mixed with them, but get very close, stay in place of them, show them that they are real people, they are the people who really working, they are in the society, and show that for them the music is not something out of the society, and bring this inside the society. And it was very successful. Had some beautiful scenes. Some of the scene was very good. You are talking too many times about the demolishing that house. It was a very emotional scene, but it has a very, very brilliant place that when the mother, the grandmother, taking the breaks and bring it out, it was very, very fantastic and very well done. The only thing that, because I'm about the low budget things, I can say that I couldn't say that this is a disadvantage of the film. The things that I would like to see more, especially when they are doing the performance, I feel that I need to see more wide shots. We never saw this group all together. I know that it's very difficult when you are doing covering such as this performances, maybe with one or maximum two camera, okay, and the poor of light and all of these things is very difficult. But I can say that this is the only technical disadvantage that the film has. We need to see more. Even sometimes we have to see the audience through the performer eyes. We never had such as this shot. The camera was inside the band. The camera playing with the band was a member of the band, which was very good. But the camera never show us how the audience reaction through the band eyes. We have something to showing the people how they are doing, or clapping, start to be a part of this music. But this music, naturally, is a music that the audience is coming, and audience is becoming a part of the band. Only at this step, director was not successful to cover this. Maybe it's because of budget. Maybe it's because of budget, because they use the autofocus lenses and the type of the camera, and they didn't have any, crane or any stabilizer, any moving accessory. Maybe it's because of that. But in general, it was a very successful film. Even for a non-Indian, it brings a lot of proper question that I follow all of your guys' discussion to understand a little bit more about that. And thank you so much, because after 20 years in UAE, I never think about that, how this caste system is going to the immigrant world. It was very, very nice topic for me, because I saw some of the relation in this, in UAE, but I never understand it. No, I think that I can find that one of the reason of this behavior. Thank you so much. Thank you for the choosing the film. It was very good. That's all.
Okay. I wanted to tell you a little bit. In terms of the budget for a documentary, actually, this was, I think, eventually Ranjit, the filmmaker, might not agree. The film was funded by a government organization which actually gives decent funding. But the important reason why the film looked the way it did is because this is years of shooting. This is before the filmmaker has even gone to film school. He had already begun documenting this band because he was so close to them. So he has documented this band at a time when he didn't know filmmaking, with whatever camera he's got. When he learned filmmaking, he was documenting with much better camera, but there were times when he would suddenly hear of something happening and literally go to the village, the wedding videographer, and say, just give me your equipment because I need to film this. And in fact, he was mentioning how when they suddenly got to know that the house is being demolished, he literally he didn't have equipment, so he ran to the videographer, the wedding videographer, took his equipment, and so I looked at him and I said, how did you manage to get a crane in that shot? And he says, it wasn't the crane. I sat on the JCB machine because the JCB machine was being handled by a friend from the village who is also from that community. He was summoned and asked to do the job. That's how they got to know it was going to happen. So he literally sat on that JCB machine and went up. So in a sense, it's the life of most documentary filmmakers, that when you have your fancy equipment, nothing happens. It's when you have nobody around that you get to know that something's happening, and then you have to pull things together and just go. In fact, I asked him, I said, given that you have documented this band for so many years, what are you doing with that material? And he gave me the very, very heartbreaking news that he had it all nicely archived in his hard drives, but in that big flood that happened in Kerala 2 years ago, the filmmakers' village was completely submerged. In fact, they were on the rooftops of their houses for 2 days. So a lot of his material has actually, years of archiving this beautiful music and this band has pretty much got messed up, which is heartbreaking news. But yeah. Nizar, your mic is off.
There you go.
I got it. Yeah, I'm just curious also just to learn. I mean, I'm familiar a little bit with Indian cinema, like some different traditions, but in documentary itself, are there different forms? Because I sort of liked, there was a sort of detachment. I liked how there was no victimization. It wasn't playing. There's a lot of documentaries that come from the third world that are always playing for festivals in Europe, or their funding's coming from Europe. So it takes 5 years of development, and it looks really beautiful, but the rhetoric is of, look at us, we're victims and stuff like that. But this one had a certain style, and I'm just in India, are there different schools that, like, we prefer the more poetic style, we prefer a more breaking the fourth wall and having, people speaking to the cameras, or what's, I don't know his background, so does he have a certain belief in, like, documentary, or belong to a certain school? Because I mean, we studied in film school poetic, Bill Nichols, there's all this academic stuff, but I'm wondering if anything goes further or different in India in general.
So the Indian documentary community is really quite diverse. So you have the very fiercely political film that foregrounds the political issue. I'm sure you know of Anand Patwardhan and his style of filmmaking. You have a lot of documentary filmmakers in the last 20 years who have got into a very, very poetic style, and a very will not necessarily look at the burning issue of the day head on, but would sort of unravel it very, very poetic, in a very poetic way. You also have a lot of films now, especially in the last 10 years, funded, as you said, by a lot of European commissioning people, and there's again very beautiful films coming out, but there's a particular language of of following a story, of following a protagonist, of letting the story unfold, which is another style that has come about. And then there are many activists who picked up the camera as an extension of their activism. There's someone like me who studied in film school. I don't fall into the poetic style of filmmaking. Neither am I an activist filmmaker. Neither is anyone commissioning me. So in a sense, in a weird sort of way, I sort of, so there are many like me. And it's beautiful because everybody's bouncing off each other. We all pretty much know each other. And again, Ranjit, I apologize. I'm going to represent you now in a particular way. Ranjit comes from a film school. I come from the Film and Television Institute of India, which is the oldest film school. But in the last 20 years, there's the Satyajit Ray Film Institute, which is also run by the government.
In Calcutta?
In Calcutta. So Ranjit actually has studied editing, not direction, from that film school. That film school is the film school that, in a sense, became the base for a pitching forum, of a documentary pitching forum that invited everybody, from Europe, from Japan, the festivals, the commissioning agents. And Ranjit was a student at the time when that was happening. So after that, there have been a lot of films that have also gone into purely observational cinema as we understand it. So I think there are very interesting things happening with Ranjit. I'm again apologizing to Ranjit for presenting him like this. But Ranjit, because he's so closely involved with this group, does not take on that observational eye, which became very, very popular in his film school. It really became the kind of documentary that came out of his film school, which was, and Calcutta at that time, observational film. But because these are people he has grown up with and he knows so closely, there is a language that comes out of that engagement. So there is a sense of being observational every now and then. But as I said, this whole conversation on caste is something that he pushes for. And it becomes a way in which suddenly, while looking at his rough cut, they're listening to each other's experiences, something they've been together 15 years, but they've not spoken about it. So I think Ranjit comes from, and then again, being a filmmaker from Kerala, these are films where Kerala has the most vibrant film society movement in the country, even today. So there's a way that irrespective of which fancy festival the film goes to or not, it's going to be watched all over Kerala. Though Ranjit's own, I hope it's okay for me to represent, Ranjit's own sense is that this film gets a bit ignored in the Kerala context because of this discomfort in engaging with caste as being a very important issue in Kerala. So there is a way in which, even in the liberal circles, there is like, oh, it's a lovely film, but this is really not an issue in Kerala.
Sorry, Surabhi, is there anything else from Mr. Reggie that we can see? Any other film from him?
From him?
Any other? Yeah. Is there anything else?
No, I don't think so. He is currently writing his fiction feature film. So good luck to him. But he's edited a lot of films. And I can pull up his list. When did I get unmuted? I actually, at this point, something that I wasn't sure whether I should begin my little presentation with this or end, but I'd like to share something that's not from film. It's actually an artist who was with me in the Shanghai Biennale. He's from Kerala. He's from the Dalit community, and his artwork, in a sense, really speaks to me. And I have a feeling that his work and this film happened for me around the same time. So for me, I'm not able to unlink these two works. And I'm going to share an image of this work. It's called Noon Rest. Can you see the image? Yes. It's a tree and it's got these sickles on the tree. And the artist is Vinu BV. He comes from the Dalit community as well. And in Malayalam, it translates a little differently, but the English title is called Noon Rest, which is the time when the farm laborer, who is almost always a Dalit laborer, is allowed rest the sickle on the tree while they, eat and take a little nap. But this is also a call to one of the first strikes in Kerala by farm workers, who are all Dalits, who were protesting a demand, a right to education. A child from their community had been sent to a school, and there was a lot of backlash about that from the upper caste communities. In fact, the school was attacked and all of that. In response to that, all the farm workers went on strike. So this resting of the sickle on the tree is both talking about the point that the worker has access to his body only at rest. Otherwise, his labor is all that is visible to society. At the same time, it is this first Dalit revolt. And I just feel that this image of the sickle on the tree and the songs that the band sings and the lyrics, they really tell us a story that the subaltern wants us to hear, that they are telling us. And it's just a really moving work that is there. So I thought I'd just bring it into this conversation to connect it to this very powerful film on music.
Surabhi, I always hate to cut these things short. I mean, as much as we do, programming in the space, and now we're back operational at limited capacity, and we have a full-time program. It's really like the most rewarding takeaway of the period that we were locked down is starting this program of CineTalks and being able to have these conversations that perhaps sometimes in the physicality we're limited from being able to have with such candor, even though this is clearly the beginning of a larger conversation that needs to continue, and we try to do it through the lens of cinema, as the linchpin. But this has been incredibly rewarding, and also I think a good reminder for us. I mean, I was reading Bill's comments on the role of the curator and the role of the programmers and the role of the platforming that's involved in and putting these films out to the world, and being, whether it's the native informal role or other capacities of discovery and sometimes even colonization through platforming. That's a very important kind of reminder when engaging specifically with music documentaries, because there is a sort of a legacy of documentaries that have contributed to the fetishization of underground movements or underrepresented movements in specifically in musical expression. So this film kind of is in a way resistant to the entire sort of ecosystem of selection and of creation and of budgets and of that format. So I thank you so much for bringing it to us, and if you're still listening, thank you for making it, and I hope to hear from you. I mean, our contacts are available, and I'm happy to share them with Surabhi, and if there's anything else that we could continue this conversation with, please stay connected to us. Thank you, Surabhi, so much for taking the time to do this. If you would like to share any final thoughts, or even I don't know. I've kind of gotten into the habit of asking for sort of a truncated anthology of sorts. I've recommended, you pointed us to this artwork, other films that perhaps we could refer to extend this conversation, literary works and so on. That would be fantastic if you have any off the top of your mind.
In terms of talking about documentaries on music and caste, there's a lot of work that has already happened in India. So there's a whole list of films that I can sort of create an anthology. The the link that I wanted to give is, again, to address something that both Deepak and Nizam brought up is, there's this group called Dalit Camera, and they have, it's a group that has started by students. It's really crowdfunded, and they put up videos which are like very, very, they're not made by filmmakers. They're made by students and by activists. And there are conversations that they've created. There are interviews that they conduct. There's literature that has been put out. If you just look for, thank you for giving the link. Very, very important conversations. In fact, the most recent conversation that I was reading up yesterday is with this writer called Sujata Gidla on the Cisco. So Sujata Gidla is someone who has written a book, first-person narrative that was published by one of the big American publishers. She lives in New York, and she was interviewed regarding the Cisco case, and again asking her to see what are the parallels between racism and casteism and how it plays out. So Dalit Camera did this interview, I think, yesterday, and it's a really remarkable interview to understand how the two connect, but also what are the important ways in which to create distinctions. Dalit Camera is a really important resource where it is not us representing them. This is really a platform that they have created, where one of the critique that Nizam spoke about of Arundhati Roy comes from the Dalit Camera group as well, if I'm not mistaken, right? Nizam, were you?
Dalit Camera actually was started by Ravichandran Bhatran. Now he has converted to Islam, and now his name is Rais Muhammad. Recently, like 6 months ago or something. Right. So the other group is Roundtable India.
Yeah.
The Roundtable India, they were behind this wicket in Delhi. So Dalit Camera, it's still, the main, the people behind Dalit Camera were mainly students. Especially from FLU, English and Foreign Language University in Hyderabad, and HCU, Hyderabad Central University. So it's Rais Muhammad now. His former name was Ravichandran Bhatran. I just want to point out.
Also, in the past 5 years, there's been really very important Dalit student leaders who have come out. There was soon after this government came to power, there was an incident. There was a student who died by suicide in Hyderabad University, where he claimed it was because of the kind of institutional casteism and discrimination against him, and that opened up a huge student movement. In fact, my own film school, we were not discussing caste at all, but these two movements came together and became the basis for a lot of student protest against the current government. So there's a lot of important things that are happening within the country at the moment, specifically to do with caste, and the backlash has been equally violent against both the Dalit and Muslim community in the current right-wing dispensation. So it's a very, very, very volatile time at the moment, and becomes even more important to discuss this. So thank you so much, Butaina. Oh, where did you go? There you go. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Nizam and Deepak, for filling many of the gaps in what I had to say. And thank you, all of you, for your questions.
Thank you so much, Surabhi. Again, the discussion will be published on our YouTube channel, CineTalks, so you can refer to it and share it with whoever was not able to join us tonight. Our next film will be Malcolm X and the Sudanese, led by Hisham Aidi. We will be sharing information about the dates and the details and the access to the film. So stay tuned, and I hope to see you all there, and I hope to hear more from you in the coming weeks. And if you are in Dubai and out and going places, please come by, have some chai, and hope to see you soon.
I hope we can travel to Dubai soon.
Hopefully.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.